name is Hummingbird, and today I'm coming to you with my thoughts on President Joseph Robinette Biden. I'm filming this on Monday, July 22nd, and just yesterday, Biden announced that he was stepping back from the presidential race. This script was written before he made that decision, but that doesn't matter. What I have to say will still be relevant because it doesn't look like Biden is about to resign from the presidency. And that means we're probably still in for a lot of drama because Biden's brain is not getting better and is likely getting progressively worse as we speak. I'm going to lay out my whole theory here, a combination of Biden's astrology, my historical astrological research, my personal story, my deep state studies, and a few things that my spirit guides have shown me over the years. There won't be any space for debate over the reality of Biden's cognitive decline on this channel or in this video. So if you're not comfortable with that, I recommend just finding another interpretation of his astrology or something else to watch. I've been talking about Biden likely having a neurodegenerative disease since 2022, and I've been suspecting it honestly since 2020. And after so many years of zero mainstream acknowledgement, it's been wild to see the recent shift in conversation, even though almost everyone still avoids the deeper discussion beyond whether or not he should leave the presidential race. I'm going to get into some clearer definitions and a little bit of science later in the video, but I'm not a professional and I don't know Biden personally, and I am going to comment on this because I'm not playing by those rules that say that I shouldn't or I'm not allowed to. I think I'm approaching this subject with integrity, and I think that it's more important to have this conversation than to play by those rules. Since 2018, I've been researching the United States Pluto Return, an under-discussed astrological transit that peaked in 2022 to 2023, and which speaks to the multifaceted breakdown and transformation currently happening in the United States. In 2022, I did a study of historical Pluto returns of other countries, and I found multiple examples of leaders with some kind of neurodegenerative or mental health issues, as well as multiple leaders who died during their country's Pluto return. I also have personal experience with dementia. My mother, bless her soul, had some type of early onset dementia and died at the age of 67 in 2020. And I helped to take care of her in the years before she died, most intensely in 2018 and 2019. So when I first questioned Biden's cognitive health, of course, I wondered if I was just hypersensitive to it, if I was just projecting my own experience onto him and his unusual communication style. I did research, I read about his stutter, I watched old interviews with him, from his vice presidency where he did sound pretty weird and pretty wild. I honestly tried to talk myself out of believing that this could be true. But especially once I looked at Biden's astrology, it all started to come together and there was no way not to see it. Now I know that my experience gave me a developed eye to notice things, like the faraway, lost look you can see in his eyes sometimes, the filler words and phrases that show up in his sentences, and of course, at this point, the repeated slip-ups and bizarre mistakes that he makes. Also, my experience showed me how heavy denial can be. Even typically smart, practical people can refuse to see things that are in their faces when it's something that they really don't want to see. And there's something particularly slippery about this kind of illness. Something mental, something cognitive is easier to overlook, especially at first, than if a person is physically not well, for everyone involved, both the person themselves and the people around them. And the progression of this kind of illness is unpredictable. It's not linear. There are long plateaus in between sudden steep declines, and there are a lot of both opportunities and reasons to fool yourself. And all that is to say that I can see how we got here. I'll wander a little bit into conspiracy territory at the end of this video, but mostly the bizarre, irresponsible way that this is being handled, the way people even now are not really having the conversation about what it means to have a president with dementia, even as they're getting all up in the drama about him dropping out of the race. I think an awful lot, if not all of this, can be attributed to the heavy mental defense mechanism of denial, activated on a mass scale, especially within the reality bubble of the Democratic establishment. So again, I can just see how we got here. Let's go ahead and get into Joe's natal astrology. This is a older, lovely picture of him that I thought I would pop up. So I wish I could go over everything here, but this is already going to be a long video. So mostly I only have time to talk about this big complex alignment, which is his Scorpio 12th house planets. Almost all his personal planets are here in Scorpio in the 12th house. They square the nodes, and they also square Chiron, conjunct his north node. So that's the main area of the chart that is getting transited right now. And that's the main, thing that I feel like relates to his health issues as well as everything else that's happening. Before I get into that, though, let's just touch on his childhood. So Biden has the moon at 0 degrees of Taurus conjunct the centaur Nessus. He also has the asteroid Ceres in Pisces on his IC, the bottom of the chart, this area that relates to early childhood and ancestry. I've read a bunch of articles about his childhood and family, and I'll link those sources below. And the interpretation that I give here is just kind of a summary of a lot of sources. So here's what I think. Ceres on the IC, this placement means that Joe was a mama's boy. He doesn't like to talk about his father much. His father may have been an alcoholic. That's a pretty common thing with a Pisces IC, alcoholism or some kind of addiction in the family tree. But his mother was very supportive of him, probably to a fault. With Ceres, there are themes of a mother's overprotection or overattachment or over-emotionality. There's a story that Biden has told a few times about his mother giving him a quarter when he was young to go back and punch back a school bully, somebody that had punched him first. And there's also reporting that he himself was a bully in high school, which would make sense with the moon conjunct Nessus. Nessus can bring in themes of power and power abuse, and bullying can definitely be a piece of that. Biden has suffered from a stutter since childhood, or I don't know, maybe suffered is not the right way to put it. There's some interesting reporting on how he's dealt with that. And I think that having a stutter makes sense with a 12th house Mercury. So here's his Mercury in Scorpio, 21 Scorpio in the 12th house. 12th house planets can have trouble extending themselves out into the mundane world. And Biden's mom is quoted as saying something like, "You're just so smart, you can't get the words out fast enough," to encourage him when he was struggling with the stutter as a child. So that really resonates with a 12th house Mercury and then a Sagittarius rising. The Sagittarius rising, this fire sign, it is going to be moving fast. It's kind of always going to be going and always want to be moving forward. But the 12th house Mercury might struggle to keep up with that pace. His Taurus moon illustrates a solidness that I think people have liked about him, kind of from a distance as a politician, but it also illustrates a stubbornness that I think, was really on display up until yesterday, when he was absolutely refusing to drop out of the race. And when I first looked at Biden's chart, I was just like, wow, this is a classic politician's chart. All of his 12th house planets in Scorpio are very strategic, very behind the scenes, kind of manipulating power and dynamics behind the scenes. And then the Sagittarius rising is the part of him that can give speeches and kiss babies and spark enthusiasm and say weird shit and get away with it because everybody's just kind of, used to him being out there and quirky. So it's just that combination of all the Scorpio in the 12th, and then the Sagittarius rising definitely looks like somebody who could be successful as a politician, and also maybe somebody who would be drawn to that world of power games. And of course, a 12th house Scorpio, like that doesn't have to be negative. I have 12th house Scorpio and planets in there too. So it doesn't have to be super power hungry and manipulative, but it definitely has that potential. And the more that I learn about Joe Biden, the more I feel that coming from his Scorpio 12th house. Also, I cannot imagine an image that combines the Scorpio and the Sagittarius better than the dark Brandon image. Kind of cracks me up. So these late Scorpio planets are also part of this bigger karmic configuration, especially the Sun and Venus are in pretty tight squares to the nodes here, and in a very tight square to Chiron in late Leo. Uranus is also, kind of part of that configuration if you put everything together. So the South Node describes a person's karma. It's the patterns and the dynamics that you are trying to evolve away from, while the North Node describes the antidote to that karma, the energy that you need to lean into. And typically the North Node is somewhere that we feel kind of uncomfortable. It can be somewhere that we don't really want to spend our time. I think that's more commonly people's experience with it. But there definitely are also situations where the North Node behaves like a head without a body. Too much of a medicine can be a poison, that kind of a thing. So there are times when people get lost in the North Node. And I feel like with Joe, especially because it's tightly conjunct Chiron, that is what has been happening. So this alignment of the North Node in Virgo conjunct Chiron in Leo is really interesting. The last decan of Leo, the last 10 degrees of Leo, is associated with something called the divine right of kings. And so many American politicians, including all of the presidents, at least back to George H.W. Bush, have prominent placements in late Leo. And I'm going to talk about this more a little bit later, but I want to zero in on this Chiron for what we're looking at in his astrology, because I think this is what has been very activated, what's really been showing itself. Chiron in Leo in the 9th house is a karmic wound associated with leadership and with pride. The Virgo North Node, so that speaks to themes of service and duty and humility. And the 9th house speaks to leadership, not so much the leadership of a boss as much as the leadership of a teacher or a guide or a mentor. And Biden probably wants to be that kind of leader, even maybe feels destined for it. I feel like that kind of comes out subtly or not so subtly in the way he talks about his role, and his post-Donald Trump role, that kind of thing. With that North Node, he probably cares a lot about his legacy, how he's going to be remembered, what he's putting out into the world. And yet with Chiron right next door, this karmic wound, here he is throwing his legacy in the trash. Actually, I wrote that line before he dropped out of the race. I think that at least on the surface level, what we see this year will actually probably look like Biden establishing a great legacy for himself, but long term, that Chiron and his general karma is definitely throwing his legacy in the trash. So that's just a little about Biden's chart, and I will come back to that. But now let's switch gears and learn a little bit about the US Pluto Return and some important history. The United States Pluto return is a transit that peaked between 2022 and 2023, but which really stretches on for years on either side of that peak. The Pluto return means that Pluto is back in the same place it was in 1776 for the first time since then. I've been writing and talking about the US Pluto return since 2018, and I'll link to some more in-depth resources. I'm not going to get too deep into it at all here, but the basics are that Pluto's return is bringing America's chickens home to roost and activating Plutonian themes like karma, war, death, exploitation, and also transformation and rebirth. Pluto ultimately is about the process of metamorphosis, life becoming death, becoming life again. In 2022, I wrote an essay putting forward my theory about Biden's dementia and its relationship to the US Pluto return. Doing research, I manually tracked the historical Pluto returns of England, France, Spain, Russia, and the Roman Empire. Out of 17 total Pluto returns I tracked, there were 7 during which a country had a leader who was cognitively ill in some way or had a leader who died, and in 2 cases had both. Just a few highlights of those are Francisco Franco, who was dictator of Spain for 37 years. He stepped down during Spain's Pluto return in 1973 and died from Parkinson's in 1975. Joseph Stalin died in 1953, the year of a Russian Pluto return. King George of England was king for most of the late 1700s, and he was also king during England's Pluto return in 1803 to 1805. There's a movie about him called The Madness of King George. He possibly had a very rare genetic disorder that caused him to have kind of spells of insanity during his reign. And he died a little bit after his country's Pluto return, but in 1810, so not that far after at all. There's also Napoleon. There's also King Philip of Spain. There's a couple other examples too, and that will have to be in another video. But other themes of Pluto returns include changes in borders and changes in alliances, but no country has ever been a global hegemon like the US at the time of its Pluto return. Pluto has a dissolutive effect. So think of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. First, once the caterpillar goes into the cocoon, the cells of the caterpillar completely dissolve into a goo. The leader of a nation is carrying the energy of that nation in their own cells. They're the designated embodiment of the state. And it makes sense to me that this dissolutive effect could manifest in the actual physicality of the person whose body is designated as the embodiment of the state in their actual brain. Given the frightening military and electoral edges the US is currently traversing, it's very, very dark to have this dissolution as part of our Pluto return. I'll say a little bit more later on about who I think is really in charge, but ultimately I think that this is a chaos factor, a wild card. No one is controlling it, and no one saw it coming until recently. The pace of decline is hard to predict, and like I said, there are plateaus and then there are fast declines. I think that Biden just recently had a fast decline, or is right in the middle of one. You don't know how fast, how far that's going to go. And this is also karmic. It's definitely karma, going back to ancient Rome, I think, with a lot of these world leader psychopaths, and who knows, what beyond that. But Pluto says that there are larger dynamics here at play than any individual or group of individuals can control. So now let's take a look at Biden's transits. The main transit that I think is illustrating Biden's cognitive decline is this long-term 6th house transit of Uranus opposing all of his 12th house Scorpio planets. Traditionally, the sixth house is associated with health. It's also associated with a person's lifestyle, their habits and routines and basic maintenance of self and life. And it's associated with the kind of health problems that relate to habits and lifestyles. So transits here can wake you up about the need to change your routine or upgrade your self-care, that kind of thing. What I've seen is that 12th house planets and transits also relate to health. And they relate more to spontaneous health issues like breaking a bone, for example, or mysterious health issues like when you have a rash for no reason or, some kind of symptom that you can't find the root of. Dementia also feels like a very 12th house thing because it's very hard to put your finger on. When you're interacting with someone, especially someone in the early stages of cognitive decline, it's not obvious. But if you know this person from before the decline, something just feels a little bit off. And the person will say something and it can basically be perfectly normal or it can be perfectly rational, but something just tells you that they're not quite all there. And the 12th house is known for having a behind the veil kind of vibe, as opposed to the sixth house and its daily life themes. Think the ecstasy and the laundry, the spiritual versus the mundane. So you can see how an illness like this kind of straddles that axis. It is a physical thing. There's actual physical degeneration happening in a person's brain. That's Uranus in the sixth house. But especially because of Biden's personal planets in the 12th, there is this very intangible quality to it as well. Another interpretation of having all your planets, all your personal planets in the 12th house like this could be that he's a hard to read person. There have been reports of Biden being unpredictable, of him having a sharp temper with staff at unexpected times. That could be a 12th house Scorpio trait for sure. And that could be another factor in how things got so far. If he's always been hard to read and unpredictable, that creates even more leeway for people to justify strange behavior. Uranus has been impacting Biden's personal planets one after another since 2018, 2019. Which was when Uranus first entered Taurus and was conjunct his moon at 0 Taurus, before moving on to this ongoing opposition of his Mars, then his Mercury, Sun, and Venus. And still in the middle of the end of this opposition, still going on for another year and a half. Uranus brings paradigm shifts. It does not leave anything the same as how it was. And Taurus relates to physicality. It relates to the body itself. The progress of neurodegenerative diseases, the plateaus and fast declines, are also Uranian. So Uranus stations retrograde opposite Biden's sun and square his Chiron on September 1st. And his dropping out of the race is already centered around this transit. When I saw the timing of this transit, I thought that his dropping out would probably happen a little bit later, like maybe at the convention or around that time. But I think that, as I said at the beginning of this video, there's still more drama to come. This disease is not going anywhere. And so the timing of this Uranus station, also the fact that the day that the convention starts on August 19th, the sun is conjunct his Chiron that day. I think that there definitely is still more to unfold involving Biden over the next couple of months. The other important transit to be aware of is Saturn, which transited opposite Biden's Chiron and aspected his nodes between late 2022 and late 2023. And I'll say more about this a little bit later, but I think these Saturn transits correspond to when some high-level handlers may have swooped in to start controlling Biden's schedule, who he interacts with, that kind of thing, and probably just making a lot of calls for him, particularly around the not real country. Saturn also just stationed retrograde on Biden's IC. That happened on June 29th. And I think that is timed to this fast decline that we've witnessed over the past few months, which just really was made evident at the debate. But we were seeing weird clips were coming out every day, leading up to that. Pisces definitely has a dementia kind of vibe, just like the 12th house does. All this slipperiness and room for projection that I've been talking about, the not all there quality of someone who's afflicted. And so with Biden's IC and South Node getting transited by Saturn, the planet of death and time and consequences and mortality and endings, it just also kind of brings these bigger themes together. Now I'm going to tell a little of my personal story. As I mentioned, my mom died pretty recently from early onset dementia. She was never officially diagnosed with a specific kind because by the time we as a family had gone through enough of the acceptance process to see a specialist, the disease was so far progressed that a diagnosis wasn't a priority. And what I learned while researching dementia is that there are many scientifically distinguishable types. And at a certain point, when it comes to categorizing their symptoms, humans are just drawing lines in the sand, trying to pinpoint diagnoses within the quantum, nonlinear, infinitely complex realm of the brain. With Biden, it's pretty clearly not Alzheimer's, but there are multiple other types of neurological degeneration that his symptoms could be connected to. So this is my beautiful angel of a mother, Kathy Elizabeth Jacobs, RIP. Her symptoms most closely fit with a type of dementia called frontotemporal dementia. During the process of coming to terms with her illness, I really witnessed what a powerful cognitive mechanism denial can be. I saw it in the people closest to her, and I also saw it in some of the professionals that we were engaging with. And I really saw how the nature of the disease makes it so much easier to stay in denial. It's a double whammy against reality, when reality is both something that you do not want to see, you do not want it to be reality, and it's extra easy to second guess because the disease is so slippery and intangible, especially in its early stages. In the situation with Biden, it's even easier for people who aren't personally close to him, but who are just as invested in him not having dementia as they would be if it were an actual loved one of theirs, to stay in denial. There are plenty of narratives, plenty of thought-terminating cliches available for anyone who wants to affirm their chosen delusional reality. And it's much easier to stay in denial when you have zero personal interaction with the person and are used to seeing them through heavily edited clips. I won't go into my mom's temperament, but she was not like Biden. When someone's brain is degenerating, they lose the mechanisms, the neural patterning that typically reins in our most irrational impulses. You might call this the prefrontal cortex, you might call it the superego, but basically the psychological structures that keep our deepest insecurities and wounds and antisocial tendencies reined in. With dementia, you lose these defense mechanisms, and for some people, their worst traits come out. And that's really what I see with Biden's Chiron. In his Chiron, Biden has a very visible karmic wound of pride. But it's so interwound with his Virgo North Node that it's hard to distinguish the two of them. The Virgo North Node is a life of service. It speaks to his visible career in government. It could also speak to his religiosity, which I think maybe is being taken advantage of by his handlers right now. But Chiron, right next door to the North Node, says that there will always be a wound of pride chasing anything selfless. Chiron in Leo is a wound of narcissism, a wound of myopia, a delusional hero's complex. In a more developed person at this point in their life, this could be a humbled leader. But in Biden, it looks like it's still just immature and aggressive. And, I really see it in the interview with Lester Holt, where Biden said that he would only drop out if God Almighty told him to. His anger and defensiveness at the calls that he was getting to drop out, and his feeling of it, feeling betrayed by people like Obama and Nancy Pelosi, who were starting to kind of coordinate things behind the scenes. He's so prideful. Was so condescending in some of those interviews, so defensive. The thing that he said that where he would be satisfied if he didn't win, but he did his best. So to me, I feel like the defense mechanisms that used to temper that kind of pride and narcissism, to recognize when they were not socially appropriate, are not really functioning anymore. One other thing that I want to emphasize from my personal experiences, I've noticed multiple times news anchors laughing or kind of suppressing a giggle when the camera returns to them after showing a clip of Biden saying one or another bizarre or incoherent thing. And I remember when I first started living with my mom to take care of her, there were times when I would start laughing uncontrollably when she was talking, sometimes at very inappropriate moments, like in public or whatever. I think that response is kind of like a pressure release for the brain, because it can feel like your brain is short-circuiting. When someone is saying something bizarre but acting like it's normal, and in the moment you're like, how am I even supposed to engage with this? Like, could this really be reality? It can feel like your brain is short-circuiting, and laughing is like a nonverbal default. It's like where that emotion and that energy and like everything that's kind of like building up inside of you goes. I feel like there's also something similar with people who have said that they literally couldn't watch the debate or Biden's recent press conference. Like, there's this visceral need. Physically, you cannot like be immersed in it, be close to it. You feel like you have to remove yourself because the dissonance is so intense. So now Biden is out of the race, but in the mainstream, it seems like the conversation about dementia has completely dried up. It was there for a few days after the debate, but when the news cycle veered back after Trump's assassination attempt, the whole conversation was based around polls and whether or not he should step back from the race. Here's the thing. There are plateaus and then there are fast declines. In the earlier stages, there are good days and bad days. And I have thought for a while that they might have Biden on experimental medicines. But ultimately, you can't stop the decline. And ultimately, even on a good day, a person with a neurodegenerative disease will not be able to function. So I do think that there's maneuvering happening behind the scenes and has been for a while. Like I said before, overall, this is a karmic wild card. No one planned it, no one has full control over it, and there's also been this collective denial, which might seem coordinated, but which my experience tells me could very easily just be organic. Even with Biden out of the race, this denial is still in effect, with the mainstream discourse ignoring the fact that we have a president now whose brain is disintegrating. However, I do think that there are people at high levels of the political establishment who are not in denial and who have been managing Biden outside of his awareness probably since early 2023, when Saturn opposed his Chiron and first aspected his nodes. And then in November 2023, right after October 7th, Saturn stationed retrograde at 0 degrees of Pisces on Biden's south node. And I think it got more intense at that time because they needed to manage his opinions and his choices about the military situation. I actually think they haven't had any trouble doing that because Biden's deeply embedded Zionism is just another one of those things that the psychological defense mechanisms are no longer tempering, but they at least probably anticipated that it would be even more essential to manage his behavior. So who are these handlers? Who makes the calls that manage the president? And who would be the first to have these conversations away from the president? Who would consider themselves outside of the hierarchy that starts with the president? Well, one thing I would say is that the DS abhors a power vacuum. The dissolution of Biden's brain created a power vacuum, and whereas eventually that power vacuum might have been filled in other ways, maybe by the Democrats, maybe by Biden's family, maybe by Trump by way of election, it's unsurprising if CIA military higher-ups got there first. This would be maybe a few public faces, some other more behind the scenes people, some old school people who aren't officially in government anymore, getting together saying, hey, we need to do something about this. One thing I've learned is that these are people with holes in their souls, and one of the reasons they carry out their crazy plots is because it's how they get their kicks. Exercising their power in secret strategic ways, sure, for money, for the protection of colonial interests, but also because it is how they entertain themselves. It is how they get themselves off. They all have huge egos and love an opportunity to be conniving. So a situation like this is a wet dream for them, a perfect chance to do all kinds of secret plotting and manipulating behind the scenes. Because another choice that could be made, right? If you're a group of high-level political actors having this conversation, another thing you could do, instead of hiding it and manipulating it, is bring the conversation to the press. Force it out into the open. Let the public confront it. Let Biden confront it directly. But obviously, these people would never do that. They would always choose power plays and manipulation and deceit. So I don't have evidence of this, but this is something I've been shown in visions a few times, that there's a circle of high-level military people, Joint Chiefs, some of the generals, and again, maybe some of these behind-the-scenes people who had these conversations and started to create a perimeter around Biden, basically controlling his schedule, who interacts with him, what kind of information he gets. And this became more tightly managed during that second Saturn station in the fall of 2023. Saturn brings an energy of contraction, restriction, protection, boundaries. So I think at this time they started letting less people interact with him, letting less information get to him. I think they have hidden from him how big the protests have been against him and the way that his full-throated support for genocide has ruined his legacy. I speculated that they have a double for him, someone to send out on bad days or occasionally to events if they thought he couldn't handle it. There are some real weird pics, and my main speculation has been that they made a high-quality prosthetic mask and didn't tell Biden about it, but I don't have a strong opinion here. I think that it's a thing where they want him to think that he is still fully running the country. Because even with dementia, he's still a strong-willed, egotistical man himself. So they just stay 1 degree out and manage his schedule or who he interacts with. I think they probably have him at mass a lot. They probably have him doing light exercise and resting, like that, kind of arrangement of his schedule. And I'm definitely not saying that Biden doesn't have any agency or that his every move is controlled. The whole issue is this is a person with a huge ego who's president of the United States, and dementia is only going to make that ego and arrogance come out more. So I think until recently, the handlers have just wanted to keep the status quo. They've hoped that by managing Biden in this subtle way, they could keep things smooth until the election, keep people not questioning his cognitive abilities, and just keep him generally under control. By not confronting him, they could avoid the possibility of his ego and arrogance causing a scene and destabilizing the country. Maybe that strategy shifted recently, or maybe the earth just moved beneath everyone's feet. So there's a lot more that I could say on my DS theories, but I really want to get this video out right away, so I'm going to let them continue to unravel in the rest of this series. Next up is Donald Trump, then Kamala, then RFK Jr., and then I'll lay out my full take on the upcoming election. If you want to know what that is right now, you can watch the live stream on my Instagram called Deep State Rising USA 2024 from last November. One of my basic predictions was that Biden wouldn't make it to the election and that the Dems would pull off this kind of switcheroo, so I got that part right. I also predict that Trump will win, and I think that Kamala might just lose in a landslide with RFK Jr. possibly coming in second. One important piece of astrology to consider with all of this is Neptune in Pisces, a super foggy, hazy, delusional energy that is present until Neptune fully leaves Pisces for Aries in 2026. So what I foresee with Biden is that his neurodegenerative disease will basically be buried until after he leaves the presidency. There might be a little more drama in the next couple months if he speaks at the convention, if he's still, trying to be public in any way. But if the decline continues, they'll stop letting him be public. And now that he's not running, it won't be too hard to tuck him away even further. It is interesting that he made his announcement that he was stepping back, through a letter and not with a press conference, not live. Maybe they'll be able to coordinate him exiting the presidency without it really ever becoming public that he has a neurodegenerative disease. I would not be surprised if that's the case, because obviously there's going to be enough shocking news to easily distract people from that subject. The, media is going to have enough other things to focus on. Biden might die in a few years and they might not even say how he died, or they'll bury it at the bottom of the obituary. And basically it will be a timely headline swept away by whatever new, more important drama is happening. And I guess we can only pray that that's what happens. That's the most benign possibility when you're talking about an already lame duck president with 6 months left in office whose brain is disintegrating. So thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you liked this video and hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the Collapse Astrology US Presidential Election series. Peace, y'all.